Hello and welcome to this Meanwhile Elsewhere on slavery in the USA, which is going to give you a little bit more information when thinking about the inquiry question, how did the transatlantic slave trade change the world? Main historical concepts that we're going to learn about in this Meanwhile Elsewhere are the word abolitionist, which was a person who campaigns to get rid of or abolish the slave trade. The cotton gin is a type of engine which sped up the process of picking cotton. Emancipate means to free, such as the emancipation of the enslaved people. Indigenous peoples refers to the people who are native to America and where the United States of America was. They're sometimes referred to as Native Americans. And the USA is short for the United States of America, and the USA became a country in 1786 when it declared its independence from Britain, and it came up with a new constitution in 1789, which are the rules for how a country should be run. So what was the situation over slavery in 1789? Well, the USA came into existence in 1776 after winning the Wars of Independence against the British. However, at that time, the USA only included 13 colonies in the east of what is now the USA, and there were divisions over slavery right from the start. Now, in the year 1789, America got a new constitution, which was a set of rules for how it should be run. Now, slavery is being phased out in the 7 northern states of the USA by 1789, and people began to talk about the divisions between the North and the South over slavery. So slavery wasn't really in as much existence in the North as it was in the South. Land in the North was not suitable for plantations, whereas in the South, the climate was much warmer, and that meant there were many slave plantations producing cotton. Now, if you study that map there, you can see what we mean by these 13 colonies. So it's really important for you to know that when we talk about the USA in the late 18th century, it was much smaller than the current United States of America, with states such as Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, New Hampshire, and Georgia being part of those original 13 colonies. So here we can see an image of enslaved Africans being marched into Kentucky in the late 18th century in order to be sold. So slavery was actually increasing in America into the 19th century, and we're going to find out a little bit more about why that was the case. So a little bit of background to slavery in the USA. Enslaved people had been transported to the Americas since the early 17th century as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved people were used on plantations that grew things like sugar, tobacco, and coffee. Above all, enslaved Africans and their descendants were made to work on cotton plantations in the South, in the southern states of the United States of America. So slavery was increasing in the USA in the late 18th and early 19th century. And we know from our inquiry that the slave trade was abolished by Britain in 1807 and then slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. But meanwhile, elsewhere, within the same time period, slavery in the United States of America is actually increasing. So although the cotton plantations were in the South, there were enslaved people throughout the 13 colonies. And the economies of all the 13 colonies actually depended on the enslaved workforce and the crops grown. By the sort of 1820s, around about 42% of American exports were cotton. So cotton was big business in America in the 19th century. Now, the number of enslaved people grew rapidly between 1790 and 1830. So in the 1790 census in the United States of America, there were 700,000 enslaved people, but by 1830 that had grown hugely to 2 million. And as we can see from that map there, it's really clear on that map in 1830 that the vast majority of the enslaved people were in these southern states of the United States of America, such as Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi and Massachusetts, places like that. So why did slavery increase in the 19th century? Well, the first one was the development of this new machine, which was known as the cotton gin, gin being short for an engine. And it was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. Now, cotton is quite a fluffy white material and it's full of seeds. And in 1793, Eli Whitney created this cotton gin, which would remove the seeds by machine. And that made the whole process of picking cotton and processing it much, much faster. And that meant that the plantations could grow cotton now on a massive scale. And this cotton was sold all over the world, making the United States of America extremely rich. What this meant, though, is that there was a huge increase in the number of plantations in the South of America, and it also created an increased demand for workers in the form of enslaved people. And that's one of the reasons why the number of enslaved people increases in America between 1790 and 1830. So here we can see an image of Eli Whitney's 1793 gin, the cotton gin, and how the process worked. So this process basically removed the seeds by machine from the cotton, and therefore it made the whole process of picking cotton much, much faster. Now, we found out before that when the United States of America came into existence, it only included the 13 colonies. But during the early 19th century and the late 18th century, the USA began to take over more land. Firstly, they began to take over lands in the south and also the northwest from the indigenous peoples, who were the native people to the United States of America, sometimes known as the Native Americans. Particularly this land in the south was suitable for growing cotton on new plantations, big farms that were created in the south. Now, following that, in 1803, they purchased 530 million acres of land, the United States of America did, in the Louisiana Purchase from France. And this basically enabled the United States of America to take control of a huge amount more of territory. Now, this combined with all the new lands in the south that the United States of America took over, meant that there was a huge increase in the amount of plantations. In fact, these southern states became known as the Cotton Kingdom. This, of course, led to an increased demand for slavery in order to grow cotton on the plantations. So the second reason why slavery increased was because the USA had taken over more land, more of this land was being used for plantations, and therefore that created a huge demand for slave labor. Now, we've already seen that there were huge divisions within the United States of America between the North and South over the issue of slavery. And many people in the North began to campaign against slavery. And these were the so-called abolitionists, who were people who campaigned for slavery to be got rid of. And a couple of really important individuals in the 19th century were William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan, who began to campaign against slavery. And they created the Anti-Slavery Society. And there were lots of different groups that were created across American states, particularly in the North. And you can see there's a picture of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in 1851. So this was an important act of protest against the issue of slavery. Another really important event that happened in the 19th century was the development of what was called the Underground Railroad. Now, it's a bit of a misleading title because the Underground Railroad was not underground and it was not a railroad. But it was basically, the idea of the Underground Railroad was it saw people in the North working to free enslaved people in the South from slavery. And they would take them across these so-called routes and passages through the land that were known as railroads. And it was underground in the sense that it was secretive and people didn't know where all of these different routes were. Now, key individuals who were involved in the Underground Railroad were people like Harriet Tubman and also people like Frederick Douglass, who you can see pictured there. So these are the main abolitionists who campaigned against slavery. So William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe was significant because she wrote a book which was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a novel that was published in 1851 that spoke out against slavery and showed what life was like for enslaved people. Now, this sold 2 million copies in 10 years and was really influential in changing many other people's minds about slavery in the United States of America and what the experience for enslaved people was. So that was a really significant event as well. Now, in 1861, the tensions between the North and the South over slavery broke out into a civil war. As we've seen, the USA was very, very divided between the North and the South. The North didn't have slavery and the South did have slavery. And these tensions eventually led to a civil war over this issue. Now, the trigger cause of this conflict was that in 1860, a man called Abraham Lincoln, sometimes known as Honest Abe, was elected president. Now, he was from the Republican Party in America, and he'd promised to end the issue of slavery. He felt that it was causing lots of divisions in American society and threatened the United States of America. He was concerned that the United States of America would actually break up. This led, when his election was announced, his election victory, it led to some of the southern states saying that they would no longer want to be part of the United States of America. Now, the northern states didn't accept this. They wanted to keep the Union, and this caused a civil war, which is a war between two sides from the same country, between the North and the South. Now, the North was known as the Union side because they wanted to keep the whole of the United States of America united, and the South was known as the Confederacy. They wanted to break away and form their own country called the Confederate States of America. Now, during the American Civil War, President Lincoln issued on the 1st of January 1863 a order, or sometimes known as a proclamation, called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this was a promise to free enslaved people in the USA if the North, the Union side, won the Civil War. Already enslaved people in the South were being freed as a result of the fighting. For example, in 1861, the North captured the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and the main harbor, which was called Port Royal, and that led to 10,000 enslaved people being freed. And during the conflict, many enslaved people escaped from the South, and many enslaved people began to fight for the Union Army in the Civil War. By 1865, the North had won the American Civil War, and slavery was abolished in the USA in what was called the 13th Amendment. And after this, slavery would never exist again in the United States of America. Now, although it is extremely positive that slavery had been abolished, black people were still suffering from racism, poverty, and prejudice in the USA in the 19th century and beyond. And for many black people, although they had been freed as enslaved people, their lives didn't always improve as much as perhaps they would have hoped. Many black people were working in quite low-paid jobs. Many continued to work on the plantations, getting paid very low wages, and were known as sharecroppers. And there was an increase in racism and discrimination also in the late 19th century, and of course into the 20th century as well. And this led to a campaigner called William Du Bois writing that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. What he means by this is that the lives and rights of black people were still being restricted in America, even though enslaved people had been freed by those changes as a result of the Civil War and President Lincoln. Now, the legacy of the slave trade and racism and discrimination, of course, can still be felt in the USA today and, of course, around the world. And that's really important for us to consider the significance of the issue of slavery, and ultimately helps us to answer that key question about how did the transatlantic slave trade change the world. Thanks very much for listening to this Meanwhile Elsewhere about slavery in the USA and how it came to end in the middle of the 19th century at the end of the American Civil War. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.